Hi, this is Sue from the Mountain Canary Company. Ed's going to visit with you about treeless saddles. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sue, for introducing us. Thanks again, folks, for coming by. For some reason, I seem to be on a saddle roll. You know, years ago, I was at a tax store doing something like spending money more than likely, and I noticed an interesting saddle set over there on a stand. I went to visit with the owner I knew well, and I said, "Dan, what the heck is this thing?" He said, "Well, that's the latest and the straightest. That's called a treeless saddle." Basically, all it was a pad with a candle and a fork hooked to it. And you know, it kind of looks sensible in a way. But boy, since that day, I've had a lot of adventures with treeless saddles, and sad to say, none of them have turned out worth a hoot. I stumbled around and looked at that for a while and thought, you know, I'm going to buy that and try it on that horse of mine. So I did. And you know, I got to a point where I really didn't like it. It was, you know, it was just kind of hard to deal with. If you got it wrong, you wanted to fold up, and it sure didn't want to stay in place. You'd have to darn near cut him in half. And the way the stirrups hung off the darn thing, your stirrups were hung connected way too low, and you didn't have any swing. You could swing at the knee, but you couldn't get any movement from the hip. So it left me unstable. So I sold it. And later on, Sue got looking at one day and said, "You know, that looks pretty sensible, Ed." They redesigned it a little bit, you know. I went and bought another one. And, you know, nothing had changed. It still was a piece of junk as far as I was concerned. Now, one of the things I found about them is there's not much air exchange underneath them, including the pad isn't doing much because you've got this pad assembly wrapped around them in that type. And you end up putting an awful lot of heat on the animal's back. Not only that, you put a lot of heat on your own butt. For some reason, they are hotter than heck to ride. I coined the saying, you end up with diaper butt riding them for a while. And you really do. And so that one went away. So years passed, and I'm packing, and I keep having a hard time because I'm swapping some riding saddles around back and forth to some of my animals. And I'm having a hard time fitting mules. So I thought, well, maybe this would be a solution. And you know, again, I tried them. You know, I developed a lot of expertise on them. I pulled in all kinds of different ones to try them on. And one of the things I found was the stirrups, okay, let me go back a bit. Anything pressure you put on the top of that saddle migrates directly into their backs. Now, I brought a saddle in one time and I was sitting on the darn thing, and the stirrups, it came out of Canada. The stirrups came up and they hooked, and they were right underneath my legs, and I felt this lump under my legs. And I thought, well, you know, if that lump's under my legs, it's more than likely going through. And that saddle was only built with a padding between me and the animal's back, just a kind of a heavy, thick padding. Well, that didn't sound too good. What I needed was something that was relatively firm. And what I ended up with was this, what they call a Star Trekker saddle. They're made in Germany. I've got 2 of them here. I've probably got, I don't know, 4 years on them before I gave up. And they were built with a firmer, you can see this, a relatively firm base. And then they have Velcroed in pads. These are inch-thick leather covered pads. And they had a gullet you could change back and forth from narrow to wide. I thought, you know, that's a pretty good deal. So I went ahead and got one. Actually, I bought 2. I'm not going to go out there without putting Sue out. She's going to have to experiment too. So when I started riding the darn thing, the first thing I noticed was it kept pushing me forward in the saddle. Now you can ride around for an hour or 2, and if you're off balance a little bit, it doesn't really bother you that bad. But if you go for a couple of days, that's real noticeable. So I ended up being forced, at least it was built in Germany, and the German engineers, they don't want to talk to you. I was forced to reinvent the wheel. In other words, I had to come up with a shim system that goes back into here that lifted the front of this saddle up so that I at least had a level ride. Okay? Now that went along, and okay, I got along with that okay. And I was doing all right. The problem was that you weren't very secure in the saddle. So I did hook buck and rolls on these things at one time. And they were pretty good. Again, I said pretty good. I have been off one of these probably 3 or 4 times. The worst time I went off was I was packing into a place called Boulder Shelter, and the gal helping me was leading Lizzie, and she managed to get Lizzie stuck between 2 trees. As I rode up to check it out with the rest of the string, we got swarmed with black flies, and everybody went a little bit ballistic. Can you imagine? They were just like bees, but they were. I've never seen it happen before. I've never seen it happen since. But actually, we were swarmed by a big batch of black flies. It had to be the time of the year or something. And they all got turning around, and I ended up being spun out of this thing because there was nothing holding me on. And I'm dodging feet, rolling uphill, and I got away. I didn't get hurt. Nobody got hurt. It was fine. Got away. But I did mark that this wasn't working. Another time, Marty lost a footing and slipped down, and next thing you know, I'm off and just flop, fell off of the ground. No big deal. But I was off. So that kind of gives me some idea that I'm not happy with this system. And then but the coup de grace was that these stirrups originally were hung down low on a D-ring. And when I bought the saddle, I bought them without the leathers or without the fenders. I got it cheaper, and I wanted to build my own anyway because what they had I didn't like. So they used to hang down here, from here down. Well, what happened was, that put a pressure point here. Well, now you didn't think it was, because you saw that hard surface, you shouldn't think it makes any difference going through that. I got up in the Dosey Wallops at 10 Mile Camp, pulled the saddle off of Monty, and by gosh, if there wasn't a blister on both sides in the middle of her back, and I couldn't figure out why. And she was well padded. This should not have let it come through. That should not have let it go through. What could it have been? Well, before I left, I swapped saddles out between her and Josie, and I put this on Josie and rode Josie down the hill, which was only 11 miles, but I rode Josie out. And when I got out, pulled the saddle off, there were 2 blisters on Josie, and we were blisters. This was serious business here. This is the worst I've heard animal with a saddle. So when I got home, I pulled the whole thing, went in, doctored them up. Next morning, went out, threw the saddles on, and started looking underneath, feeling underneath. And you could feel, if you sat down on this, you could put your hand underneath and feel the D-rings underneath it. So I ended up cutting the whole thing apart, putting them up, moving them up so they were not a pressure point. Well, you know, that's a heck of a note. But that's me. I'm capable of doing that and willing to do that and willing to find the problem, solve the problem. Most folks aren't, sadly. And so the answer to this was, now this was probably one of the most armored Treeless saddles I could find. And you know, that next step, I went ahead and said, I'm sorry, but I need a saddle with a tree in it. I'm going to have to buy several saddles to make them fit if I have to. So next thing I did was I started looking into treed saddles, learning how to fit saddles better, and learning which animals fit what saddle trees, or what saddle trees fit what animals. There's either way you look at it. So it was quite an eye-opener to have a problem where I sort up these girls. And I have seen situations where people have ridden some of these saddles, treeless saddles, the ones that are pads, pure pad, and they wonder why they come back, and a couple of days after riding it, they look at the animal's back and it's all white. It's all that heat. There's something about those that just really hold the heat, and the way they're ran, if you look at them and ask a couple questions. When you look at them, ask a couple questions. One, how hot's this damn thing going to be? 2, where could there be a pressure point? Now, there could be a serious difference just in your anatomy that can form a pressure point. Now these, my pin bones weren't a problem, even though I'm scrawny, kind of a scrawny type. But you take one of those other ones and you sat on it, you could feel that your pin bones were directly against their backs. There was nothing underneath them to give them any real pressure relief. Now I remember the old story about the princess and the pea, where she could feel pea under multiple mattresses. Well, this is pretty much the same thing. It's what depends, it all comes around, you can have padding coming out your ears, but if there's a part where it starts with a pressure point, somewhere down the line, microscopically, there's going to be a pressure point. So to get away from it, you're going to have to build those multiple mattresses like the princess. So, which isn't practical, because now your saddle won't stay in place. So if for a day rider, and if you really want one, I'm not going to stop you. Boy, I'm not going to jump up and down and say, you shouldn't do it, you shouldn't do it, you shouldn't. You do what you want to do. As everything around here. But my experience has told me I don't want one anymore. I've got one here. It fits my little Rosie horse. I'll put this on her if I have somebody that's going with us that needs some help me, needs to ride Rose. I'll put this on her. Rose is out for a little while and she's back. But for constant work and hard work, these are not your babies. Okay, folks, I hope I made anybody irritated that really loves treeless saddles. But you do what you want to do. I'm telling you, for my experience, they haven't worked for me. And for a person who's going to ride long distances and over again, I'd highly recommend you give it some harder thought and look it over. Could there be pressure points? What part of the saddle could... It's still different. Here, in a treat saddle, the weight is distributed over these hard bars. And I don't know what somebody says, oh, the hard bars. Well, sometimes a rigid frame will give you a lot more protection. These are also for protection of the back, not just to keep the saddle on. So, okay, folks, I'm sure not afraid of a controversial subject. You ought to see when I get around to barefoot horses. Okay, thank you all for coming by and visiting with me. Thank you very, very much for coming by. And remember, be kind to each other. Think about your animals as kindly as you can. Ride as often as you can.